Welcome to the Broadway Buzz, sponsored by Webster Bank. My name is Stuart Brown, the developer of SoundsOfBroadway.com, the 24/7 online Broadway radio station featuring the best from off-Broadway, Broadway, and the London stage. If you are a musical theater fan, then make sure you tune into SoundsOfBroadway.com. I will be your host of this podcast series. For this episode, I will be talking about the musical Chicago, which will be playing the Palace Theater in Waterbury on Saturday, December 3rd and Sunday, December 4th. For ticket information, go to the Palace Theater's website, palacetheaterct.org. Chicago is a 1975 American musical with a score by John Kander and Fred Ebb, book by Fred Ebb and Bob Fosse, who also directed and choreographed the show. It is set in Chicago in the Jazz Age and is based on a 1925 play of the same name by reporter Maureen Dallas Watkins about actual criminals and the crimes on which she reported. The story is a satire on corruption in the administration of criminal justice and the concept of the celebrity criminal. The original production, so we are going to be seeing at the Palace Theater the 1996 Broadway revival, but the show originally opened on Broadway on June 3rd, 1975, ran for 936 performances, had a great cast: Chita Rivera, Gwen Verdon, Jerry Orbach. Again, Bob Fosse directed and choreographed the original, and his style is strongly identified with that show. The 1996 Broadway revival holds the record as the longest-running musical revival in Broadway history and the longest-running American musical in Broadway history. It is the second longest-running show to run on Broadway, only behind Phantom of the Opera. In the West End in London, the revival is the longest-running American musical in West End history. According to Fred Ebb, he wrote the book in a vaudeville style because the characters were performers. The show was called a vaudeville because many of the songs he wrote are related to specific performers of the era, like Ted Lewis, Sophie Tucker, Eddie Cantor, and Bert Williams. I always find it interesting about the backstory, to learn about the backstory of musicals. Here's just a few things. You have the double snap in Razzle Dazzle. Well, that was added as an afterthought at the suggestion of Fred Ebb to John Kander. So John Kander explains, "I remember when we wrote Razzle Dazzle, before we took it in and played it for Bob Fosse, you," Fred Ebb said with absolute confidence, "try adding a couple of finger snaps to it. Bobby will love that." We adored them, and as soon as he heard the song and the finger snaps, he loved them too. During rehearsals, Razzle Dazzle was originally staged as an orgy on the steps of the courthouse. Fosse was talked out of that staging when Jerry Orbach convinced him that he was missing the Brechtian subtlety intrinsic in that number. In a reversal of roles, Bob Fosse decided the lyrics to the song Class were too offensive and censored John Kander and Fred Ebb's original version. The 1975 production received mixed reviews. The show opened the same year as Michael Bennett's A Chorus Line, and that show was highly successful both at the box office and at the Tony Awards. In fact, the original production of Chicago was nominated for 11 Tony Awards and won none, because A Chorus Line primarily won the majority. The show was on the verge of closing when it ran into another setback. Gwen Verdon had to have surgery on nodes in her throat after inhaling a feather during the show's finale. The producers contemplated closing, but Liza Minnelli stepped in and offered to play the role of Roxy Hart in place of Gwen Verdon. She ran for about 1 month in August of 1975 to September, boosting the show's popularity until Gwen Verdon recuperated and returned to the show. The current production of Chicago, like I said, is not based on the 1975 production, but on the New York City Center Encores show, and that opened in May of 1996. So Encores celebrates the rarely heard works of America's most important composers and lyricists, and normally that production will only run for a handful of performances. Some have transferred to Broadway. Chicago is the most notable example. So from May 1996 at the New York City Center Encores, and then it moved to Broadway, opening on November 14th, 1996. It was directed by Walter Bobby, with choreography in the style of Bob Fosse by Ann Rankin, who also starred in the production. You had in that show Baby Newirth, Joel Grey, and James Naughton. The show retained the spare and minimalist style in costumes and set from that New York City Center Encore's production, and that's what we'll be seeing at the Palace Theater. The show was very well received. You had Howard Kissel in the New York Daily News saying, "This Chicago impressed me far more than the original." Ben Brantley in the New York Times said, "Make love to the audience was another Fosse dictum. That's exactly what Miss Rankin and her ensemble do." You had one critic state, "Society has changed in light of events such as the O.J. Simpson murder case, and audiences were more receptive to the criminal as celebrity theme of the show." The revival was much more successful at the Tony Awards, winning 6 more than any other revival in Broadway history until the revival of South Pacific in 2008. As of this podcast episode, Chicago has run for over 10,000 performances on Broadway. That concludes this podcast episode of the Broadway Buzz. Again, Chicago will be playing at the Palace Theater in Waterbury on Saturday, December 3rd and Sunday, December 4th. For information, go to the website palacetheaterct.org. My name is Stuart Brown. I hope you will join me again for another episode of the Broadway Buzz.